I'm joined today by David Dunning, who is a social psychologist. His research focuses on accuracy and illusion in self-judgment, and you may recognize his last name from the Dunning-Kruger effect, which we have talked about on this program quite a bit. Now, David, I talk about Dunning-Kruger quite a bit, both on the program and in personal conversations, and I don't even want to take the risk of misstating what it is. So let's start there. What is the Dunning-Kruger effect meant to designate?
Well, the way it's understood in popular culture is that incompetent people tend not to know that they're incompetent. Actually, you can scratch that. They're not in a position to know that they're incompetent. They don't have the skills to recognize just how many errors and just how many mistakes that they're making.
And does this apply to a broad range of activity and endeavors in life, or is this really something that when you first explored the phenomena was designed to address a very specific type of circumstance?
Well, there should be some specificity to it. That is, we're talking about areas in life where to produce right answers and correct responses, you need the same skill set that you need in order to judge whether or not a response is correct or not. And there are just a lot of skills in life that are like that. So logic is like that. Problem solving is like that. The theories you use to solve problems are often the theories you use to judge whether or not a problem has been solved. And so though it has some specificity to it, it turns out that there's a broad swath of intellectual skills and a broad swath of social skills that fall into this category.
So increasingly, this has become, amongst many people I know, something they like to refer to when they seem to hit a roadblock in having a political conversation with someone else. And I'll give you an example. You tell me if this is an appropriate application or reference to the Dunning-Kruger effect. If you're talking to someone who, for example, is against abortion, right? And they're telling you they really want to reduce the number of abortions, and you explain to them that the way to do that, as has been empirically demonstrated, is you teach people reasonable sex education, you provide access to birth control and the knowledge about how to use it, and you try to prevent pregnancy because most people who have an abortion are pregnant. That's typically the way it goes. And they can't seem to wrap their mind around the fact that they are both against abortion and they want abstinence-only sex education and they don't want people to have birth control. Is that an example where they're not recognizing, they're not able to understand the logic of what you're telling them? Would this be an appropriate application?
I think that would be an appropriate application. That is, when people just simply can't get your logic for the type of argument that you're making. Now, mind you, this is an appropriate application, but remember that it's also the case that the person on the other side might also be experiencing an appropriate application of the Dunning-Kruger effect, because they may very well have logic that has some soundness to it that we ourselves are not getting. So the one thing I always like to remind people is that Dunning-Kruger is not only a phenomenon that happens with other people, it happens with us, each of us, many more times than we would know. And I'd like people to keep that in mind.
Your work with Dunning-Kruger seems to me to connect also with your work on moral character. And some of your research there has uncovered, maybe not surprisingly to many people, that most people think of themselves as morally superior to everybody else, but don't seem to realize that everybody is kind of victim of this mentality, and thus either everybody is right or everybody is wrong, in which case the difference between you and the others in terms of moral character would logically evaporate, wouldn't it?
Oh, I think that's right, and we've shown that time and again that people do put themselves on a moral pedestal that simply can't be. It's unrealistic. People make judgments of themselves that they just can't attain in reality, and when we observe them going through their lives, don't obtain in reality. And the surprising finding for us is that when it comes to understanding the moral nature of people, we're actually pretty good at understanding other people's moral nature. We understand what's going to influence them, what temptations are going to succumb to, what strengths they have in the moral realm, and what weaknesses they have in the moral realm. And what we tend to do is not apply that wisdom to ourselves. So what we've been able to find is that people are making an error in self-psychology, though they tend to be pretty good social psychologists in judging other people.
If we are to agree, at least temporarily, or for the purposes of this conversation, that in general we're better off if we are more accurately able to evaluate ourselves in relation to the world around us. Some people may not agree with that, but let's assume, at least for this conversation, that we can agree with that.
Sure.
Are there mechanisms that you've identified by which people can talk to themselves, as the case may be, in a way that allows them to get outside of these biases you've identified?
Well, yeah. So one easy way to do it is to just talk with other people. I mean, they're already outside these biases that we've talked about, and sometimes they may be a little nervous about telling us what they really think. But sometimes, if we can get them to tell us what they really think, it can be incredibly useful information that never would have occurred to us. That's number one. Another thing that people can do is ask themselves a question they don't normally ask themselves, and it might be an uncomfortable question, but it might prevent some discomfort later on, which is, instead of thinking about how I might be right in any decision or reasoning I've come to ask how am I wrong? What's wrong with the decision I've just made? And even project yourself into the future and say, okay, my decision turned out drastically wrong. It was a disaster. What happened to make it a disaster? And thinking that way certainly gets you outside of the usual box that we're in, but it also clues us into any objections or reservations that maybe we should be entertaining in the here and now.
So the connection that I saw as I read a lot of your work between people's self-assessment of their morality with the Dunning-Kruger effect is that it seems with the Dunning-Kruger effect, what we have in practice, even though it may not be so explicit, is people are also assessing their own competence to be higher than it is in reality. Is that a fair correlation to draw?
That's a very fair correlation to draw.
And when we go from talking about one's self-assessment of moral character to more issues of competency and the Dunning-Kruger effect, there, it would seem to me that it's tougher to circumvent the limitations because by your very lack of cognitive ability, you're not realizing the area in which you lack. So is that more difficult to get around?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the issue with our moral superiority or our feelings of false moral superiority is a lot of that is active self-deception. A lot of that is in the business what we refer to as motivated reasoning. We're actively trying to hide from ourselves our imperfections. Now, with the Dunning-Kruger effect, our lack of ability to see our imperfections are exactly due to our imperfections. And even though we might be trying hard to come to an accurate vision of ourselves, even though we might be very honest and impartial and thorough in the way that we're judging ourselves, the very fact that we have imperfect competence is going to mean that we're going to have imperfect judgments of ourselves. So the Dunning-Kruger effect happens well beyond any self-deception. This is something that goes beyond self-deception.
Last thing I wanted to touch on with regard to the Dunning-Kruger effect is when we think about intelligence, I think there's this tendency that people generally have to say, well, some people are more intelligent and some people are less intelligent, and it's kind of on a spectrum, but it's an absolute place on that spectrum that people have. Is everyone equally susceptible to the Dunning-Kruger effect at a level that is adjusted for where on the intelligence spectrum they are? Or to say it another way, if you have someone who has a much higher IQ than someone else or much better logical reasoning skills than someone else, are they as equally susceptible to the Dunning-Kruger effect, but it may just be with other topics or when talking to different people than those who may have less intelligence?
Well, we don't know the exact answer to that, but the exact answer I can tell you now is that sooner or later we're all going to fall victim to the Dunning-Kruger effect. That is, no matter how smart you are, you're going to have pockets of incompetence. You're going to be in new situations you've never experienced. You're going to be in areas where you think you know what you're doing, but you don't know what you're doing. And so I don't think it's a question of being equally susceptible or not susceptible to the Dunning-Kruger effect. What I can say is the certainty that each of us is going to succumb to it sooner or later, that probability is 1. The only question is where is it going to happen and how potentially costly it might be.
And if people want to read more about this, where's the best place that your work, where you write about this?
Well, I think sort of a good clearinghouse is the website for our laboratory at Cornell. If you Google Dunning and the term SASI, that's Self and Social Insight, that gets you to our lab website, and there we have a lot of links to various things that people have written about the Dunning-Kruger effect, but also various interviews that I've given as well.
We've been speaking with social psychologist David Dunning. Really great having you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.